that's why I find it quite interesting that it's these four very today relevant, active, forget even the nations. We're talking just cities at this point. We're like Accra. We're talking about like, we're being very specific here, like Lagos. We're talking like, it's quite interesting that they're like, okay, we've got something. If we turn on this flight route, then what's the trickle effect everywhere else? And maybe that's how it starts versus it trying to be this larger, like, let's solve the flight path system and making shit more affordable and like connecting all these other states. So like, actually, we can do it with these four. And maybe there's something quite interesting just there.
Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate, learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to...
Broadcast from later, we are exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their potential. A weak signal is just something we notice that could be an event, an idea, an issue, any type of development that we suspect might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives and society. At From Later, we're steady, tracking, tracing, soaking up the signs, and trying to make sense of what's unfolding. And on these broadcasts, we give a glimpse of what it looks like. And when you're trying to understand something you don't know anything about, it's structured like show and tell. Each person shares a signal. The rest of us do not know what that item is in advance. And collectively, we try to make sense of it. If you're listening and you feel lost, confused, you don't understand what we're talking about, it's no problem. Neither do we. It's literally the newest thing we know about. I don't know anything, and everybody's just trying to figure it out on the fly. So today on the Vroom Call, we have Valdez Sillins. Our producer, Jeremy Glenn, is here. I am Robert Bolton, and back again for the first damn time. My guys from Time, Clinton Robinson and Kofi Gyekye. What's up, guys? Welcome.
What's up?
What's up?
Thank you for being here. So we all worked together on Workplace, a foresight report. That was the two of you and From Later. It was a scenario sort of podcast investigating the future of work and place, which everybody should check out at www.workplace.show. Relatedly, Clinton Kofi co-founded and have since very successfully exited Lane, a workplace experience platform, and enterprising together forever, going back to Ossington Strip, Toronto in like 2008 or so, which, as the history buffs know, is the origin of all civilization. I was rapping in a group called Times New Roman at the time with Lex Jr. We were throwing parties. Robin LaCombra was still a boss already. Jeremy was there. So for the benefit of our descendants, can I get y'all to talk about like how you two originally clicked up in that time, what that time was like, and I guess the short version of somehow how that led to where you are today and what you did with Lane?
I was an immigrant leaving Europe, looking for something to do, in North America, meaning the climate wasn't the best in Europe at the time, 2008 and the Wall Street crash. You had like all sorts of like issues going on. Why did I say the Wall Street crash was not actually what happened? It was the fact that the economy was actually just pretty crap. There's just, the West, for us in Europe, we perceived it as, North America still being the West. And so I happened to hear of this amazing place called Canada. I landed into Toronto, this thriving creative hub at the time. Everybody was young and the downtown had an energy that was quite, like it was electrifying, I'd say at the time. We're talking music, we're talking art, we're talking food. There's just lots of discovery. Almost like this podcast, everyone was kind of new. It's like our first real restaurant experiences, my first parties in that kind of scene in terms of indie meets hip hop. And at the same time, you're running around in chief Indian boots for some reason. I don't know if you recall that, but there was a trend where people were doing that in Toronto. Sure. And I bumped into this lovely lady, Robin LaCombra, and she goes to me, we're about to throw an epic party on Saturday. I need some help. So the man, Clinton Robinson's at the door and gives me a keg of beer. So just keep pumping it until you run out.
Right.
Don't worry about it. I'm like, that's it. He's like, yeah, that's all you have to do. Just give them beer. Don't worry about anything else and we'll be fine. That's how we met. Right.
That's the first time, man.
Yeah. You always had good advice.
Who's this insanely like handsome dude with this English accent? We got to get him out of here. He's going to get all the babes. And I met Robin LaCombra because I just bought a house. So she was my neighbor. Yeah. And that's actually how I met her. And then got introduced to Kofi. And then we opened like an underground bar on Ossington. We did like a whole underground bar thing. where I met you because you played as Times New Roman in one of
Yeah.
your shows. Out of the back, you guys just jumped out of a U-Haul truck and did this crazy concert. So what a weird small world.
Yeah.
Toronto was super different back then.
Yeah.
It really did feel like electric, and everything was malleable. And there was this weird confluence of all these people from around the world meshing and remixing all these different cultures, styles, vibes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all met at like the high point in Toronto. That's like a high watermark. Not to say Toronto's not still like a super dope place to be, but that moment in time was like very unique and special.
For sure. I think of From Later as like an impossible business that's somehow working. And then I think back, there was one that had a really nice run that at that time, which was Miracle Thieves. So shout out to Tiffany too, which Robin and Jen and everybody else who was there.
I forgot about Miracle Thieves.
Cannot forget to mention Miracle Thieves about when we're talking about that time, which was like a art space right in that neighborhood too, at the top of Trinity Bellwoods.
Totally. And like I'm in Lisbon right now, and we're talking about how, you know, Lisbon's more affordable than like a New York or a Toronto. And that gives people the space to like create and take risks and try new things. And I think like 2008, 2009 Toronto was, you know, in hindsight, it may have felt expensive at the time because we were all broke, but it was an easy, like first class, like world class city to live in at the time. You could do crazy stuff, start up a bar or like an underground bar, a arts collective or whatever. Crazy.
It also had a soft, warm landing because, you know, when people talk about multiculturalism, I would say downtown Toronto, I'd say, yeah, GTA, like that little sphere really did embrace that. You know, it really held on to it. You're eating Filipino food on a Tuesday, you have Vietnamese food on the Wednesday, you're eating Chinese on Thursday, you're eating West African food, you're eating Caribbean food, all on like, you know, a 1 mile radius, which was kind of insane when you think about it, right? And very few cities were allowing that at the time. I think all the success Toronto has had in general, where you talk from a tech space, you talk from the art scene, you talk about music at this global scale, that was the genesis. That's truly what allowed that we can do anything mentality, regardless of who you are, and anyone belongs, you know, because you've gone far.
Since then, I know 5 versions of you since you've kind of, some of those you could tie those versions possibly to like startups and the different names and entities that were associated with them, of which I can remember some like Useful and eventually landing on Lane. So yeah, how did that, I mean, we don't need to know every single one, but how your relationship grew from that moment of, can you make sure people have beer in their cups and to Lane?
We could have like short tracked a lot of it and found some really good mentors. We didn't. Kofi and I both came from a place where like there wasn't that community of like successful people that were 10 years older than us that like could give us a playbook. Or if there was, like we didn't know them, or we were too like arrogant to go talk to them. So we like had bad mentors, and like we, you know, went through a couple of iterations of a couple of different companies that somehow were still successful, which is incredible. Useful was particularly dope because we got out of an agency that was like doing for hire work. And, you know, that I think we finally quit when we were doing like a margarine ad. Somebody wanted like an interactive margarine ad. And me and Kofi were like, we're just making digital e-waste. We can't do this anymore. So we pivoted into like, let's do meaningful stuff. And that's where Useful came from. And that was a lot of fun to like work on conscious, environmentally sustainable like activations in Toronto, like fitting out a shipping container that's growing kale and like dropping it into the downtown of Toronto, like teaching people where kale comes from, or working with our friend Ed Bertinsky on his film, The Anthropocene. That was like a highlight.
For sure.
But it didn't really make enough, well, not just money too, but like it wasn't fulfilling to like also create projects that had no life after.
Right.
And we wanted to create a longer living product. So we kind of switched into this product space.
Yeah, I think we felt also a little bit ahead of the narrative with Useful. So, you know, it was a bit too early and we didn't have the means ourselves to sustain it. You know, Useful was one of those things where, you know, in hindsight, if we had the exit, gone through that and created that, then you'd be able to actually sustain it and have, you know, create that kind of conversation. But we realized very quickly the impact we wanted to have. You know, we also didn't need money, like a certain, you know, stability and order
of course, yeah.
to like have those conversations. Yeah, hard reality.
Yeah. So jumping to the present here, Kofi, what's going on with you now? Last I know, you were starting a gin inspired by your grandmother and by the African diaspora. Is that the main project? What's going on?
So there's no main project at the moment. I'd say the main
Nice.
project for myself is the next 10 years I've dedicated to being heavily involved in the African diaspora. And that's talking about, Africa as a continent. That's all about the Caribbean. That's talking about, Brazil and European like Africans like myself. And so that's, I'm looking into that space quite heavily. I'm paying attention, my ears on the ground on that quite heavily. I think it's time for me to contribute more intentionally
Cool.
within that. That's something I was just not doing before. And so the gin actually was a nice foray into that, into just something that I enjoyed. And as that story kept going, I started to realize that, the tech aspect and the skill sets we do have, this amazing community of people I have like yourselves, and we often just don't pay attention to that part of the world. Also, from a more practical stance, there are over 1 billion people under the age of 40 and living in these places that are going to need solutions and like things that are growing, and it's not stale.
Yeah.
And how it feels at the moment. It feels young and like energetic and just kind of.
I feel you. That's exciting. And Clint, my weakest signal today is that your LinkedIn profile changed and your title now is co-founder of stealth mode startup in AI as of yesterday. So what can you or can't you tell us about that?
It's super stealthy, man. You got to be stealth.
Not very stealthy, changing your LinkedIn profile. Gotta say.
That's a good point.
No stealth aircraft flying here.
That's a very good point. Well, me and Kofi did a crazy speed run, and everybody else who was with us at Lane. We did like a 3-year speed run from like 0 to one of the, I think in like the top 10 exits for tech in Canada, which is pretty wild. So definitely I took some time off. So I just took like the last 8 to 10 months off for like just personal health,
right? Which
I think is very, 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 very important. Yeah, getting that, like I'm deep tech, man. I've been in tech forever. It's what I know the best. So I'm thinking about how do we, AI is everywhere right now. How do we actually make sure that we apply it responsibly and ethically? I think that's very important. Like we need more people who are stewards of AI than people who are just trying to go out there and do another smash and grab and make as much money as possible. So I think we need more people who are conscious going into the AI space. Absolutely. But no, I don't actually really have any details yet. But I'll be sharing them over the next couple of months, maybe on the follow-up to this podcast.
Sounds good. Thanks for sharing that much. We can jump into it then. Baldas, what's your weakest signal?
So I don't know how familiar or if you guys have heard of this project called the Vesuvius Challenge. It just popped up like 2 weeks ago. And it was started by one of the co-founders of GitHub. Basically, what they're trying to do is use machine learning technology and particle accelerators to try to resurrect these like lost scrolls from ancient Rome. And they're trying to figure out a way to train machine learning models to be able to open these scrolls that are incredibly, incredibly fragile so that you can actually read it without opening it. And scrolls are interesting to me for many reasons. One of them is that they were always kind of hard to open. So the ink on a scroll is literally wrapped in a kind of circular pattern. And so the ink would actually break off when you open scrolls anyways. And they were made with papyrus. Papyrus only lasts like 100 years. So most of the scrolls that we know of are just disappeared forever. But this one kind of trove of scrolls discovered under the eruption of like Mount Vesuvius in the 1800s. So Vesuvius erupted in like 79 AD, but in like the 1800s, this farmer discovered this like giant property that used to be owned by the father-in-law of Julius Caesar or something like that. And within that property law, there was a giant library, but that library had been kind of entirely like carbonized by the explosion. And so there are all these scrolls that basically look like pieces of charcoal. So that's like long-winded way of describing what's going on. They're basically trying to get these pieces of like effectively charcoal that nobody has been able to open for hundreds of years. As soon as you try to open it, it just disintegrates in front of your eyes. And they want to try to use this like new tech to be able to open it up and see what's inside.
My first question is, where do the particle accelerators fit into that?
It's to like read the ink on the scrolls, because they use like a particular kind of ink that is not very, I forget what the term is. I don't know the technical details. It's like radioluminant or something like that. Like it basically typical X-ray stuff is not enough. And so they have to use particle accelerators, which
I
sounds
see.
insane.
So that's like there's a hardware side to it that is like a new type of sensing or whatever that you would apply to doing a project like this,
Yeah, yeah.
like X-ray, but using particle accelerators in ways that I don't understand at all. Yeah.
Yeah, well, how's the image capturing work? That's what I was interested in.
This is usually a question I would go to Clint with. So
I have no idea. I mean, the only thing I can think of that's kind of relevant right now is they're mapping the pyramids passively by putting a huge muon detector under them. Because muons are like basically weakly interacting matter that barely interacts with anything, but it kind of interacts with stuff. So when you have like a giant pyramid sized thing, you can actually map the internals of the pyramid
huh.
using this detection method. So it's like high energy particles coming from space through the atmosphere, through the pyramids, through the Earth, but it's going to interact with like 0.00001%. And they've actually found that there's a huge cavity in the pyramid that's undiscovered. So there's a huge thing the size of the grand chamber that nobody's even been in 7,000 years. So it could be that they need a particle accelerator to create like super high energy, weakly interacting matter that's going to pass through these scrolls and like interact specifically with the ink for some reason, because they're using like is the ink like lead ink or is it like carbon ink?
It's carbon.
Right. That's crazy. So that kind of makes sense that they need something that doesn't destroy it.
Yeah.
Like a high energy particle to go through the matter that doesn't destroy it, but interacts only with whatever the ink is on the scroll. And I guess why they need AI is you're going to get like this 3-dimensional picture of a scroll that's wrapped up, and you're going to have to unroll it virtually.
Right.
So you're going to need some reference. They're going to need some kind of reference for that. So they must have like a reference scroll. But I guess you could do that. Meaning you have to train the AI to like understand what language would this be Latin? This is
see
Vesuvius.
These weird layers of scrolled up shit and then parse through it. Yeah.
But this is great, man. This like hits on like so many things that I'm like geeking out on right now.
All right.
Like I've been reading a lot of Sumerian stuff right now because there's the most like they just have all these cuneiform tablets lying around because they're like clay tablets.
Yeah.
Like they have like 5 million of them, and they've decoded like or translated like a couple thousand.
The original e-waste.
Yeah, the original e-waste. Yeah, a bunch of old tablets that people are walking around with. Yeah, how does that map to today? What are we going to learn from that? Nobody's going to look at our discarded phones. Nobody cares. Like we're not even looking at 6,000-year-old. They might. I don't know.
I mean, not if there's too many of them. I think though. But if only a few survive, they'll be so fat, and it's like probably make too much of it.
When they find your stash.
Lots of those old tablets are just like people insulting each other. They're like, "Oh, you delivered my copper ingots, and like 20 of them were damaged. Like you piece of like garbage. Like I'm gonna find you and rip your legs off and all that stuff." So I don't know. Maybe they'll find one random hard drive or one person's social account or something.
I highly doubt the information we get is going to be like, wow, revealing. I highly, highly doubt that. It's going to be day-to-day human interactions that, to your point, buddy, that are quite brutal.
Maybe,
just growing up Roman and growing up in Italy, and like a lot of the things we read, when they discovered most of the Colosseum, it was just people being stabbed with spikes and being fed to animals. This is really what it broke down to, and some trap doors. But when you break it down, it wasn't that deep, right?
Yeah, I could see that. Records of transactions and stuff that don't really matter.
Cultural stuff. That's great to understand how societies functioned. That's the interesting part, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But even today, if you broke down most of the content online, it's going to be people and their cats and their dogs on TikTok doing dances. This is going to be quite relevant to a bunch of people 200 years from now.
Depends how you're looking at it.
Yeah, right. What was Kofi doing the Dougie for the last? That's all. I don't think it was on TikTok, but whatever it is. Right? Like, what were they doing then? Why did this matter?
Is there anything like any hypothesis about what they might find, or do they think it's anything significant just based on like where they found it or anything?
I only started researching it this morning, so I haven't gotten that deep into it. Somebody online mentioned like, oh my God, what if you could have found the exoteric writings of Aristotle? Most ancient writers had like esoteric, like for their own kinds of internal training communications. And that's like the only thing that exists of Aristotle's work. And it's like basically they're like class notes. They're incredibly hard to decipher. They're quite confusing because his public writings, his exoteric writings have just been lost forever, whereas Plato's exoteric writings are well known. So if they could find the equivalent of that within this, it'd be amazing. I mean, it'd be unbelievable. But I have, that's like totally just some random person saying that in a tweet. So it's not the academic saying it.
It's a hope. Yeah.
It's a personal library, not like the Library of Alexandria, right?
Yeah.
But you'd assume if it was like someone connected to Julius Caesar in that way, whatever's in there would still be of value. It just wouldn't just be anything. Because you'd be close by to whatever was, like actually taking place and probably actually more invested in documenting what was happening.
Right. It depends on what you consider a library or like an archive, or like, is it just his personal notes, or is it like his collection of antiquities or the like books of the year, scrolls of the year, I guess, because it could just be like all his tax forms.
I was reading about scrolls before this as well, just like in general, a little side interest of mine. And I didn't realize this, but apparently the Roman, both like Republic and Empire, both of them, neither of them ever wrote down their constitution anywhere. It was never formalized. So we always hear about the Roman constitution, but we don't realize that it was actually just contained on scrolls that would be basically reset every year. And so they would just be rewritten, and the stuff that was good, they would keep and kind of move on to the next scroll. And the stuff that they changed, they would just get rid of or whatever. And so I don't know, maybe it's just like 100 years of the Roman legal details and stuff like that year over year.
Maybe this is super significant in the sense that we just don't have much data from that time period. Our data is low. So even if we find one complete trove, like one library, and to even understand what is in the library gives us so much insight. Even if it is 10% tax forms, 20% receipts, but like 10% is literature. Even that the metadata is interesting on that discovery, because we don't really understand, no idea how people really lived, because we have lost so much information about it.
Yeah, the right list of like receipts could be like so revealing if it just tells us a bunch of things that, we didn't know existed at all or whatever. It would just be more mystery, I guess, but at least it would open a door to many more doors.
And does this mean we're like advancing our capability to do more discovery of the past? That's something like I've never really thought of. I'm very like future focused, but as we discover these new technology, like who thought we could like map the pyramids or fire a particle accelerator at a bunch of charcoal and find out that they're scrolls. So we're actually able to discover more about the past as we advance our technology.
Yeah, which is quite beneficial, because a lot of what we've written and is supported today historically is, as we say, the victors choose. So it would be very interesting to go back and really take in. So like this would be really interesting in India, as an example, the Middle East, certain parts of like Central and Lower Africa, like, South America.
Dude, that's a really good point, that the victors choose what history to keep. Maybe you want to focus on things that were destroyed by natural disaster, because like whatever that dude has in his library, nobody had time to go filter it. Like a volcano wiped them out as a moment in time.
Exactly. That could be a very interesting piece.
The thing that's also really intriguing about this to me is like just the question of how good can we get at sensing what's invisible. And obviously that's been part of the history of, developing instruments and science and everything. And we're still doing that. Like this is something that potentially as remarkable as like the telescope, the microscope were for seeing things that we just couldn't otherwise view, but it's happening through machine learning. And I just wonder like what kinds of new weird sensing can we do, for what purposes? What are we going to be able to know through this means or through so many others? And what kinds of like what will we be able to learn from just some dust, from marks of like sunlight damage on something, whatever, who knows what it would be.
For sure.
Different things that like were reflections. There's a seeing a world in a bag of chips paper that we talked about on one of these broadcasts a while back. It was basically making this point that image data is recorded on something like a plastic bag of chips for a lot longer than like while you look at like a reflection or something like that. And you can basically like see it in much clearer than you would expect to through some process. I won't try to explain now.
What will be interesting is how they also, back to Clint's point early on, how do they guide the use of this technology into the right direction? It's also not useful to just like document 10% of the world and then keep.
Don't turn this into spyware.
Yeah,
Again.
right. So historically, like, wait, is everyone going to have equal access to this? Is this something that, is going to be that us as a whole, as a people can like move forward with globally? And then next, to your point, what are we going to start using this for, right? And to what degree? And it's funny because us having built Lane and getting that scale and just getting deeper and deeper into tech, I'm the complete opposite at the moment, with a lot of things. I don't want any mics in my bedroom. I'm very careful of where I put my tech. The other day I recorded, I had 200 devices in my house, and I was like, I need to curb this down. So now I'm back to light switches. Don't tell Ria. That's our other co-founder. She said, hate that I had no light switches. But yeah, it's stuff like that, right? And what can you see? And like sometimes secrets are good.
Yeah, right. Maybe we're not supposed to be looking at this guy's library. It's like, leave the man alone.
Any thoughts on where this goes, either in terms of like what's discovered, what it knows, and how that changes us as changes humanity, or in terms of how the technology develops and what can be done with it?
I think the technology will develop for sure, regardless. I mean, if you look at the camera and then you look at an iPhone camera today, you just look at our trajectory in the last 20 years, unbelievable, right? Like what you're able to capture today with just everyone can on their mobile device versus what a DSLR was doing 10 years ago, whatever it is. It's just leaps and bounds. So I think the technology will keep going and we'll keep finding like great applications for it. That's one thing about tech I'll always say, they will keep improving it. It'll take time, there'll be efforts, iterations, but we'll get to that point where this thing's actually working. If we're all invested in it, that's the actual key point there. If we all believe it's of value, it will end up working. How it changes us is where I'm a bit like worried because like, not to be jaded, but again, like, I grew up in Italy, I grew up in history daily, and it was amazing. It's an amazing thing to understand what was happening. And it's something that you hold on to, but it also keeps you stuck, right? Because our concern is we're constantly looking backwards and, we're rarely moving forward in that regard.
Right. That's an interesting take that like starting having more access than we currently do to history would make us look back too much. I tend to think it wouldn't be as much of a problem that we would. I think we pay so little attention, at least, my experience different. Growing up in Canada, we pay so little attention to our own history, to history in general, it seems like, and would probably benefit a lot from paying closer attention and learning from it in more of our decisions.
That's also probably why you guys have accelerated so much. So if you look at the top tech companies in the world, they're all between North America and this place that is constantly about moving.
Right.
And like going forward, you look at China, who historically looked at it, but they also have a very different, sort of ethos around it. If you look at Europe, it's great. We invent some cool things like really amazing pasta automated making machines.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said that like Italy kind of like figured it out and like we could slow down a lot now. Things are
let's make another espresso machine, right? Like let's get the pressure to 10 bars.
Kofi, for you, would you say is it a signal or noise?
I'd say it's a signal.
Yeah. Well, I think you just explained why. Clint, what do you think?
I think it's a signal. I think you're going to see more and more technologies get applied to like reaching into the past, get a better understanding. Even now, it's going to give us a lot of regret too, because like if you look at this pile of scrolls, they apparently just look like charcoal. Like how much charcoal have we just shoveled into the fire already? I was like, whoops, maybe we just destroyed mountains of evidence or interesting facts and data.
Yeah, isn't that funny? So much of our fuel was like knowledge.
Yeah,
that's crazy. Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, in some way, that's probably true. Will we ever get so good that we can extract that knowledge back from pollution in the air? I mean, for me, this is obviously a signal. I think it's pretty cool to even that little thought experiment of like, what do we find if there's just like a random phone, hundreds of years from now, and you just pick it up and it's like somebody doing the Dougie or whatever. I think like if we are able to extract information from this scroll and it turns out to be like comic strips or choreography of stuff like a fun folk dance that people did, that would be lit. Like, I'd love to see that. Like if we just get some fun art out of it, like, that would be totally enough of a payoff, or if we get like guidance on how to live, even better. But yeah, signal. I weird sensing is kind of like the handle I'm putting on this. That's what I want to track going forward, is like, what new types of weird sensing technologies are going to exist. And the other part is just like, this is the type of AI project that's a little like narrow and specific and like what we're trying to do, though the applications will be broad. that is super exciting to me. And just like, this is like the fun of where we're at right now with technological potential.
And less terrifying too. Like this AI isn't going to take over the world. It's just reading scrolls. That's
yeah,
nice.
it's like we're just trying to do something other than like, yeah, it's not a project of playing God as everyone's playing God and playing gotcha with AI right now.
Right.
Either trying to make a general intelligence human chatbot or trying to trick it and feel smart about themselves for some reason. Clint, what's your weakest signal?
The one that I'm most interested in, also because I'm in Lisbon right now, is this new trend that I'm seeing and people talking about of how people seem less affiliated with the country that they're from. And they're more grouping together, like physically, based on like shared values or shared beliefs or shared even desired outcome. And then like going back to my kick on like Mesopotamian history and how everything used to be city-states and like the idea of a country didn't even evolve until pretty recently. It's like a few hundred years old, where countries really started to be solidified into like the idea of like a national identity and like where are you from and what does that mean to be Canadian? What does it mean to be American? And like these ideas are becoming less and less important. And it's more like, what does it mean to be a digital nomad is more important. And like, what are the shared values of being a digital nomad or these people who like flock to Lisbon? So I'm seeing this change and I'm wondering what the impact and effect that's going to have. And, what does the world look like where people move together based on shared values rather than like duke it out in a country? And I think that's interesting for a lot of reasons because the countries are kind of too big now too. Like, you look at the United States and it's kind of hit paralysis because you just can't make a decision anymore at a country level of like, what's a good decision to make as a society? How do we want to move forward as a society? And it's like, nobody's going to agree anymore. It's like, we're split down the middle on every topic. And yeah, maybe I'll just leave that there. Maybe I'll let that simmer. Hopefully that's a good weak signal to start with.
Yeah. Is there any particular examples of the like digital nations and stuff like that? We've talked about some of these things before. Yeah. I think on broadcast. Yeah.
There totally is. But like, unfortunately, it's like a bunch of crypto bros wanted to like create a utopia in Puerto Rico or Costa Rica.
Right.
But there's other examples. I think the microcosm of it is the commune.
Right.
Which has happened in the 1800s. Actually, it's probably happened all the way back.
Right.
But recent examples in like, 1800s, 1900s, 1970s with like the hippie movement again. And the idea of people going back. Let's create a village under shared values. But yeah, I think there are examples like Costa Rica right now is like there's like 4 experiments. Honduras has an experiment going on.
Right.
And this city runs autonomously from the government. It actually has authority to create its own laws.
Right.
I guess you'd call them bylaws, actually. Maybe that's more accurate.
Right. But it has some power.
Yeah, it's interesting because like we've been trying to consolidate power. We think it's more efficient to like let countries make decisions. Rather, we moved away from the idea of like a whole bunch of autonomous remote cities or districts that are allowed to act independently. We rolled it up for efficiency, apparently. Like even Toronto, it's not Toronto anymore. It's the Greater Toronto Area.
Right.
That happened in the 90s. It's like it's more efficient to like do central decision making rather than deferred autonomous decision making.
Yeah, I think it takes less infrastructure once you actually combine those entities. So that's one thing I think the commune-like approach might lack. We look at healthcare, we look at just means, roads, just infrastructure in general that has kept us as a society moving forward and living much longer, which was not necessarily the case before, right? Before, let's use America as an example, when you're all your 50 independent states, if somebody got typhoid, there's no relief to come help them out. It's like, why would we bother with you guys? So just that's something that I think that's the one piece. Actually, there's 2. The infrastructure piece of it to be like, how are these communes thinking through that? Or is it just an ideation? Like, we're digital nomads. It's amazing. It's such a great beach. I love it. And the road I'm using was built by these guys before. And I'm just going to come hang out on it. And this is great. But what happens 20 years down the line? And are those considerations really there?
There's 2 versions of it too. There's the meta version, which is happening in Lisbon, where like nobody made the decision at a governmental layer that a whole bunch of digital nomads are going to come here. Like they may have like in the sense that they incentivized it through like tax schemes or like visas, but the plan wasn't to build like a utopian city state in Lisbon. It was more like they opened up the doors And then a bunch of people came here and brought those values and culture and things they like. And then a whole bunch of like-minded people were attracted to it. So I feel like that's the meta version of it, where it's like, well, this wasn't intentional, and it's still Portugal, and it's still the city of Lisbon, and it runs as its own government. But you've got a whole bunch of people here now that all have the shared values, and they're influencing the politics and the demographics of the area. The other version is where you go into like Honduras or Costa Rica, where it's like, we're intentionally building a city that is distinct. And here's why we're doing it and what we're doing it for. Because you're totally right, Kofi, because like, it's like if every US state decided to have a different railway track, and like the rail system would never have been possible.
You know, it's fun right now that we're enjoying this digital approach. We're enjoying this take on a nomadic life that's afforded by technology, right? And the fact that our jobs are, you know, the pandemic really accelerated that. Our connection to people, we accept this now as true connection, right? Versus actually physically meeting and enjoying that. And so do you think that's fleeting? Do you think like, okay, you know, now it's a decade in and no more of the dance parties. I'm hitting 50. I've got a family. This tech stuff was cool. This digital nomadic approach was great, but my kid needs to like be somewhere stable and like go to class. And like, do you think that's going to affect it in a way? I have no answer for that one. It's just more if you think about what, you know, why we actually decided to join these states and cities and you know, education is a big one.
Yeah, it's funny when I heard you speaking on that, it actually stuck out a lot that you brought up that the idea of a country is actually relatively new. It's something that's been on my mind is just like, what's our place in time? And a lot of the pieces here are actually very new. And it's recently struck me that, like the internet, and I think this is because of recent advances in things like ChatGPT and blockchain and so on. And we're like, the internet is very primitive still. Like we're in a very primitive place, and like as countries maybe too. And even this idea, like when you say digital nomad as an identity, like some people use that as an identity, but it's not an identity at all. If anything, it's just sort of the negation. It's like the beginning of a category that says very little about what your values are. So there's like a lot here in terms of it being fleeting, as Kofi said. Like, I don't think so. It's probably there's like on one time scale, it's like, yeah, it's a little trend. It's nothing. It's a blip. But then in terms of the potential of these various ideas and technologies and notions of identity and nationhood and all of that, there's probably a lot of potential here, and it'll take time to sort of organize.
Yeah.
Also, like governance is hard, as you're talking. It's like, and infrastructure is hard. These are not like easy problems, and they require standardization and stuff. But that's also something that I've been observing, like governance software, and just I have a lot of this with blockchain, people taking an interest in governance. It wasn't something I was noticing for most of my life until recently, that there's like a bigger group of governance nerds, and there's like people building technology for collective decision making and voting and all of this stuff, and getting more excited about it. And that's something that I think has a lot of potential for like technologies that allow like liquid democracy or whatever to just get better at democracy than the state, like as we know it. Because I mean, there's another area where I guess we're actually very primitive. It's a very basic idea of like counting votes, but we don't always even do that, and not everyone agrees we should for some reason, like count all the votes.
It's kind of analogous to like the UN, right? You know, it was spawned out of World War II and a need for people with similar values across, right? So League of Nations turned into that. And now it's sprawled on. And I would say growing up, you'd hear about the UN and you'd hear about these institutions and you'd be like, wow, this is like, I agree with those values, or, you know, I'm aligned, or they have such a big impact. And maybe to your point, Clint, and both of you actually, so that's something I would say, I wouldn't say necessarily fleeting, but I don't see the UN running as it is for the next 100 years, or if it's any of these larger institutions, right? It's kind of like we've outgrown what that was
right.
as a society and as people. And we're like, well, I get it. We all agree we shouldn't bomb each other. But most people are trying to drop out of these sort of larger governance bodies as nations and become more independent. So what happens to that, like, again, at a micro level? Because it's not been a long time since those institutions, you know, IMF, all that stuff, right? It's not been that long.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's like 80 years max at this point. Yeah. Is it fleeting or not? I will say that once there's a power vacuum that's been created, something fills it. So the vacuum that's been created is that we've lost that national identity. Like, I'm definitely not like a patriot of any specific country anymore. That desire is probably innate in all of us because it came from somewhere, and it's going to manifest itself as like some kind of new version of it. So somebody's vying for that attention. digital nomads, quote unquote, was just kind of like an example of one of them.
Right.
Like there's new identities that are being formed. And what I liked was that, yeah, you're right. What are the shared values of a digital nomad? That's like, who knows? But it seems like there's room for people to create new structures and align with them based on actual values rather than values that you're born into. And I think that's a big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're born in Canada or you're Canadian, like you have Canadian values.
Right.
And it's like now you kind of get to choose them. And we're
Right.
seeing that. We're seeing that more and more. Like things are like disintegrating as like we don't have a shared value pool.
Yeah.
It seems with a lot of people who call themselves Canadians.
Right. Valdez, I'm wondering if you have either some context for us or even I have faith that you have a contrarian view for us.
I've had lots of thoughts as everyone's talking. I mean, one was you said nomads don't have values, but I was thinking that like they're interesting historically. I know you Clint meant it just as like one example among many, but I never thought of like the historical actually link and like nomadic peoples were always parasitical on the state. So they always existed in a or you could call it co-symbiotic relationship to the state. So they required the grain of sedentary empires and the kind of stability of like a farmer society that provided it with grain for trade or through raiding or whatever. They weren't opposed basically to city states. They would wreak chaos on them every like a couple hundred years and they would, descend notoriously. And they were also more cosmopolitan and they were like more tolerant of different religious beliefs, and they introduced all kinds of innovations across like the entire Eurasian landmass. Like they were very interesting phenomena, and I don't know, maybe some of that stuff is going on right now in terms of like the diffusion of different technologies and cultural techniques and organizational forms through, the internet. Yeah.
And is that just our nature as humans, right? Because, you mentioned that as they go through, and I mean, that's Vikings, that's Romans, that's the Zulu, that is, the sweet, like Maasai's, that's like just going through and their weapons became better. The idea of shelter, like to your point, like amassing all sorts of people in, which made our gene pool stronger, even just from a biological level, right? Because they're not as homogenous. And so, yeah, maybe that's just in our nature and this has to happen. And we're just at that phase and Clint's recognizing it. And it's like, it's now and we've got, it's happening again.
The word nomad is so apt too. That's a really good call out there.
Yeah, I like that.
Because there is a huge backlash in Lisbon specifically against the digital nomads because they're coming in, they're taking all the good apartments, they're eating all the Wi-Fi, they're taking all the good brunch. It's strangely analogous to like what used to happen back in the day, but it's like a softer, nicer version for sure. But still, people are not happy that they're all here.
Right. Like
they do kind of see them like an invading plague of people who are sucking off the state, or not even the state, but the infrastructure of the community.
Right.
And then moving on when all the Wi-Fi and brunch is gone.
Right. I do like, Valdez, that you kind of like looked at the word like that. I always appreciate that kind of way of understanding one of these signals. But it's true. It made me feel like maybe I'm cynical and like digital nomads are more than just like co-working tourists with laptops on the beach. And
if I were to put counter stuff on that, would be that one is I think there's been a resurgence of like state capacity discussions in a way that hasn't existed for a while. And so we're kind of at the tail end, in my opinion, of like from the 70s to the present, kind of the tail end of a particular era of how to organize the relationship of state and economies. And there's been a lot of like movement in terms of like reinforcing what the state is able to do or what kinds of decisions it can make. So for instance, one of the things that digital nomads benefited from was a kind of race to the bottom in terms of like taxing, as you kind of like sort of hinted at. And I think, with things like a global, this is different, but a corporate tax floor that's being floated right now, minimum 15%, to kind of prevent this like race to the bottom in terms of taxation, is like bringing the state back as a kind of competent actor, because it has kind of been seen as just being, I don't know, second fiddle, inferior, inefficient, stuff like that. But there's a lot of problems with markets, they're not necessarily the best at long-term investment, for instance.
I still find states and all that quite inferior. In fact, you just stating that. And it's mainly because if you look at like the age gap ratio to our leadership, and so there's understanding their capacity to have these kind of conversations without the lens of the past, as you said, in that structure that's existed. That's where my frustration is. I can't point at one leader today in any of these larger nations with these large markets. I could be like, yes, you.
Finland, New Zealand.
Still unrelatable to some degree because they hold on to like what is New Zealand and what is Finnish. They're still doing that, right? It is still it's a very insular approach versus more of a global look to say, okay, what's happening? Let's restructure our banking system so all of us can just send money how we want and not have a million disparate, solutions for that. And so maybe as a digital nomad, I can move closer, and to your point, then we can have a better taxation sort of system that is, even killing that we can all understand. We could probably use blockchain. So it's like you actually just did leave this place and we all knew you came from here. And so with that, you're joining this society and these are the things you did here, and they are not going to fly, or they will, holding each other accountable in a way. I just feel like so disconnected to any leadership in that way as an individual who's in this nomadic type of approach.
I mean, I feel that, and I feel those frustrations. And then sometimes I'm reminded, and especially as I watch people who are experimenting with like governance and digital citizenship and trying to run democracy and all these things, and realizing, yeah, it's so fucking hard to make it efficient. Like they run into the exact same problems. They're just basically doing their own little model of civilization game and learning the same things and finding the same frustrations and building, for good reasons, the same inefficient systems. And so like that, to some extent, we end up with these like slow systems that are annoying for paying our taxes or do, whatever it might be that we're trying to get done, because you need certain checks and balances and just like a kind of slowness in place in order for it not to be like wildly corrupted. Not to say it's not wildly corrupted, but could get worse.
Trim it down.
Yeah. Where else do we take it? Let's do a round of signal and noise. And if it's a signal of what? Kofi, what do you think?
I think it's a signal for sure. And the main reason too is these digital nomads, we also have to forget they have the means. So whether it's fiscally, whether it is also lack of maybe that family tie and so forth. So there's a bit of a harder group of people to like necessarily pin down and bully into a situation because they're also driving a lot of these markets and the economy and so forth. So I think it's definitely a signal. It would be very interesting to see how it plays out. But I'd say those two attributes, and language as well. Actually, that's another one. Like on this call, I'm pretty sure we all, somebody speaks a secondary language of some sort, and that gives you a different kind of way to move through the planet.
Right.
And so those three things, this is a very different group and highly intelligent.
That's true. That's interesting.
Very, very different group of people in that way. It's not about barbaric like force and let's come take your grain along. But it's like,
yeah, I mean, that's maybe the surprising thing that came out of this signal for me is that like this idea that actually this group of people that we are calling digital nomads are going to be the ones really leading to big changes in the future. It's a really interesting trade-off between being like more grounded versus more transient or itinerant. Valdez, signal or noise?
To be contrarian a little, I might say the digital nomad thing I might label a noisier, but I think there's a signal in the entire discussion, particularly around like what is, I don't know, the future of nationalism or something like that. Like if I were to raise like one more kind of like devil's counter or something like that, I wonder if like what you see is not people clustering together on the basis of shared values, but clustering together on the basis of like even like micro ethnicities or something like that, like if nation states dissolve to some degree, what you see in their place, I think probably won't be a bunch of like peaceful communes, but a bunch of like warring, like ethnic enclave factions for which like WhatsApp group chats, are very effective for organizing pogroms or whatever you want to do, like something horrifying. I mean, that's very dystopian. Like you also see it to some degree, like already.
That's like walking around Brooklyn on any given day, right? Like that's really what it feels like.
What WhatsApp group are you in or not in?
Yeah.
That's a new level of access.
I mean, it's a real serious one because I've not been added to my WhatsApp group in my street, and it's a nightmare. So I'm just like an outlier in the place I live.
Oh man, what are they saying about you on there?
She just won't add me. That's it. I've been ostracized. It's a hard life.
Yeah, that's interesting that it like what kind of like, as Valdez put it, like warfare would come up, or like just maybe it's also just going to be more of a cliquey coexistence, like a very high school kind of thing. What's it? We also see a lot of those types of patterns. I got convinced that it's a signal for sure. So
We might also, this is just a random point, we might also just underestimate how cosmopolitan the past was. Like you read stories of like the 1200s and you find like random like French dudes traveling to like North Africa, traveling to like, I don't know, all over the place, all over the Mediterranean, for instance. That's just one zone, but there have always been these kind of interesting groups that, yeah.
The view of the past is often misrepresented for sure. Like there's this crazy stat that there was more coffee shops in London, England in like 1700 than there are now.
That's hilarious.
And there was probably a lot more good conversation happening in them. Like a coffee shop at that time did a different thing than like Costa or whatever. Like
100%.
You know, where like now it's chief like value is like how much coffee they can fit in the cup. Kofi, what's your weakest signal?
Interesting, ties into a little bit of what we were just discussing. So as I mentioned earlier, like I'm focused on, the diaspora for the next 10 years, the African diaspora specifically. And I've been going back since 2019. As you know, we did the podcast when I was out there. And I've just been going back and, trying to understand what that society looks like. And having not grown up in it, having grown up in the European African diaspora, going to Canada, understanding what that diaspora looks like, and then coming to America, understanding what the African American diaspora looks like. I've been in London as well, what that looks like. All very different kinds of African, quote unquote, or Black, right? In that. And so when I was out there, there was rumors about a flight. So there's never been a connection between Caribbean and West Africa by air. There's a rumor that they did this crazy like military journey and they went back and forth. And then Antigua, Ghana, Lagos are like, hey, listen, guys, we're ready for commercial flights. And we're going to have commercial flights that leave the Caribbean directly to West Africa. And, it's not hard to do. It's a 13-hour flight. We fly back and forth to Dubai all the time. That was just an excuse to some degree. So it just had me thinking, what are the geopolitical reasons why they didn't necessarily want that to be a route? What other routes may exist that we're negating that could connect these people and these ideas together? Why America and Europe were the barrier for these two quite similar diasporas to link? So, so I was reading that was where that signal came in. And then what could be the fruition from that? Imagine I, as a Trinidadian kid, and I did. I mean, look at Asia. We have a mutual friend here on this call that is Trinidad is able to live in Ghana because Ghana and Trinidad have a pact. Now, what happens when there's that flight?
Right.
What happens when we're able to cross those ties and we don't have to get a visa to America to then link up here, get new ideas, and and then fly out and return home, quote unquote, as they say, right? So,
right.
What happens with this very simple flight route? Like, what could like the potential be?
That's such a good signal. I love that. And it also, you telling your life story always makes me feel like so pedestrian for like my story of like, well, I went from Vancouver to Toronto, and that's about it.
Not even. But yeah, so that was kind of it. And I think so. First things first was, if I look at everything, I look at it from a tech lens.
Yeah,
it'd be quite interesting because if you look at our top technologies, like the Caribbean and Western Africa at the moment, they're using technology in a very practical sense, trading, like texting money to each other. Everything's happening on your mobile device, right? Like, although cash is still there, you're able to trade money, you're able to like get services on your phone, you're able to get stuff delivered. It's very much like, how do I get things from A to B? And yeah, there's a little bit of TikTok and so forth, but back to like not enough Wi-Fi, not enough signal, not enough data. There's a very practical approach to how they use technology. And like, so if you connect these two things, what could that thought process even be further, right? Because if a hurricane happens in the Caribbean, you're out. So people are like, you know what, we don't need 5G. We need something we can rely on, right? And so it's what happens to the economy in that way in terms of technology and the ideas that are generated from there.
Where is this conversation at? Just going back to like the origin of your signal, like the commercial flight, is there particular airlines that are like, we're seriously thinking about it? Like, can you characterize the conversation a bit more?
Yeah, it's just nations. It's 3 nations, 4 nations: Trinidad, Antigua, Nigeria, and Ghana, who are like, okay, listen, we're becoming little mini powerhouses. What if we connected together? And so between those nations, as an example, today, you don't need a visa to work. You don't need a work permit. You don't need any of that. You can go, you can reside, you can bank between the two. So their banks are both on either side. So unlike TD, let's say using Canadian context, and TD America, Convenient Bank, they're actually separate banks. This is the exact same bank. So I can just land in Ghana and go pull out my money in local currency and keep moving. But now that I have a direct flight, I didn't have to wait on a visa. I didn't have to get a crazy application. Like, what happens then?
Is this the Caribbean rising and like throwing off the shackles of like colonialism? Or is it because Africa's doing it? Or is it because it's both?
I think it's the African diaspora. I think it's both. I think it's people like really questioning what are the ideals and values they're holding on to and why. What does it mean to be part of Commonwealth, and do we care? Because we're not really part of it, right? We don't get Canadian Commonwealth and Ghanaian Commonwealth is very different Commonwealths.
Right.
Right. I can't just go to Australia and hang out for a year and have the time of my life and go to London and do that.
Right.
That can't happen. I still have to go through a 4-year arduous visa program, or do what I did and trick him by saying I'm going to school and then go start a tech company.
Right.
But you did go to school though.
I did do that. Yeah. It's allegedly.
Was it allegedly? Is it Barbados that just literally left the Commonwealth? I think, didn't they just kick the Queen out? The King, I guess.
Yeah, I believe it's one of those nations. Yeah. So it goes back to almost your point, Clint, on what are we looking at nations and one of those structures. Caribbean has been its own entity. West Africa, its own. Africa as a continent, its own entity. But what if we open up and now it's like this crazy 70 states that are like the United States of America, but the United States of the diaspora, and then throw in Bahia, because you can fly from Brazil up to Caribbean, like Venezuela, and all these kind of interesting routes. And so what do we start connecting there? And what are those fibers that allow us to now create a new approach of a society? And everyone's younger as well, like I mentioned. Like, what does that look like? It just kind of got kind of crazy in my mind. I said, wow, this could be quite phenomenal.
Yeah, we like to think that technology is like agnostic and that people will use technology in similar ways or find similar applications of it. But in reality, like even as you just described, is it M-Pesa in Kenya that you can send money by text? We barely just got to that point in North America where you could like tap pay. That was like a better, easier, faster system that existed already for like 10, 15 years. Mm-hmm. So even to think it's like who even knows or cares what North America is working on and applying these technologies, now that you've like linked these nations together, how are they going to apply it? Looking at a different cultural landscape, different lens, different use cases. That's like really, you're going to see like actual true innovation start to pop up.
Yeah, I'll say actually in both places. There's numerous reasons that I was listening and hearing a lot of too. One is just climate. It's warm seasons kind of, maybe for some people, they actually enjoy that approach. There are different issues, obviously, but there's something special for people who have been within the African diaspora in the West that feel like they were the others. And so when you go somewhere and everyone is like you do not have to explain to your children that the doctor could be Black and a lawyer. So I think that's the second piece that I think is quite important. And then lastly, it's the innovation is an open playing field. You don't feel like there's these massive behemoths on you. To your point, the banking system, we may be able to go and create something between these nations that's quite interesting very quickly, that actually gets a core task done, versus try to uphold a historic base of an institution and like what they've been doing and then sort of back to governance, whatever that looked like in the banking system.
Yeah. Well, and then just the cultural energy around like Accra in the past couple of years in Ghana, like has been, in my mind, this is where shit is happening in the world right now. Like this is where the excitement, this is where the energy is. And you just kind of feel that sometimes, like, there's like times we felt like Austin, Brooklyn, Berlin, wherever it's been in the past like decades that are, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's exactly why the signal was so interesting, because if you look at Lagos, it's really happening in Lagos.
Yeah.
You're looking at people like not only wealth levels and caps and so forth, but you're looking at a new way of the diaspora interacting with where their parents or whomever came from. And then you look at Accra, to your point, they've just done the best PR job ever in the world. Just be like, come here, this is amazing. And then you look at Carnival in Trinidad, and like that's a whole huge thing as well, right? If this year you were not in Carnival in Trinidad, you just felt like you were missing out in a way, right? And then you look at the Bahamians and the Bahamas, this tiny island that's actually having a massive global conversation in terms of music, sports. Yeah, these are like these hot, to your point, these gems, these hot places, and like what happens once you connect them.
Yeah. And where do you read this going in terms of like what the future of borders is? Because that seems very significant. Like you're sort of eliminating the notion of them in some of these cases, right?
For sure. What I think was quite interesting is the fact that all these nations allow for free travel. So this idea of a visa, the border may exist, but that barrier, which is we all suffer through. So you want to come to the States, you're going to need an O1, you're going to need an EB1 visa, you're going to need something. Although you're Canadian and your values seem quite close, and you could easily be, culturally grew up the same way, there's that barrier. So what happens when you don't have that? And I think that's the exciting part. I could be 19 years old and I want to fly over to Lagos and learn and work for a this, amazing tech guy in that place, and nothing's hindering me but just applying for the gig. Even just being an intern, forget getting paid. I might just want to go learn and understand, right?
Mm-hmm. I love the signal as the flight route.
Yeah, the first indicator, because it seems to indicate so much. It feels like power structures are shifting and borders are changing or falling down. And it's all outside of the hands of like the American hegemony, like they're just doing it, which is awesome. So like that's a huge indicator of like just a shift in the balance of power across the world.
I always say we got a superpower and they didn't realize they gave us that. And when I say us, I mean a lot of people from any of the diasporas, whether it's the African diaspora, whether it's like East Indian, whether it's Asian, Eurasian, whatever it is. But, again, we speak multiple languages. We have like the documents. We can go back and forth freely. We've understood certain ideas. We've seen things that we may not think work. And we have an ability and opportunity to go back and kind of start to create. Although not necessarily West Africa to the Caribbean, but look at Rwanda. They were able to accelerate so well from a technological standpoint, from a governance standpoint, from creating a new society that's actually quite admirable. More women in power than probably any other state that exists, like in a way, ministers, so forth. And that's because of that link and that immediacy after what took place. People went back and were like, hold on, let's rethink all of this.
Maybe you feel no connection to where Valdez and I are now. What is the version of this that could apply to Canada, and what would that look like? Just as a complete like adjacent lateral leap or something, not a direct sort of connection here, if anything.
Toronto, Costa Rica could be very interesting.
Okay.
I just think ease in that way. It's something that's been discussed.
Right. We got to do something before we print the new money, I think. I think it's clicking up with Barbados and putting Rihanna on the coins.
I think a similar weak signal, or actually, I guess it'd be a super strong signal, is Canada like ditching the monarchy like Barbados just did.
It seems like a natural moment, right? It's like everyone's talked about it.
And it's like completely unrelated to one flight or several flights out of the Caribbean into Lagos or Accra, but it's in the same sphere of power structure shifting.
I highly doubt that would happen, but it'd be very exciting if it did.
Prime Minister needs something to be above him or her and to bow to, and that ought to be Rihanna.
Yeah, it has to be Rihanna. I agree with you. Let's do it.
That's my argument.
Yeah.
Valdez, what do you think? What caught your attention in this one?
I think it's an interesting signal. I think like you, I'm very excited that you selected a flight path. I think that's great for just how many things you can talk about through just that one example. I don't know. I thought a lot of stuff, like I was thinking of like Chinese investment in infrastructure, and I was also thinking of like how difficult the African continent itself is relatively difficult to traverse. So like opening up a flight path to the Caribbean like is strange because it almost makes it easier to go there than it is to travel like maybe somewhere more towards like the interior or something like that. And then I wondered about, I don't know, the geopolitics of like the hub and spoke model for flights and stuff like that. So there are these super hubs. And then I guess I realized that as far as I understand, I don't think there is one on the African continent.
Not like that. But what's quite interesting of your point, that's harder to get into, the content in that regard. That's why I find it quite interesting that it's these four very today relevant, active, forget even the nations. We're talking just cities at this point. We're like Accra. We're talking about like, we're being very specific here, like Lagos. We're talking like, it's quite interesting that they're like, okay, we've got something. If we turn on this flight route, then what's the trickle effect everywhere else? And maybe that's how it starts versus it trying to be this larger, like let's solve the flight path system and making shit more affordable and like connecting all these other states. So like, actually, we can do it with these four. Let's even just talk about understanding from social cultural context. I mean, for myself, it changed a lot when I went and realized, oh, this is how the society functions. I completely grasp why people think it's patriarchal, but it's actually very matriarchal.
Yeah, just the idea of how biological citizenship fits into this, and the previous sort of digital nomad signal is really interesting, and like whether that kind of technology is going to really change how people choose to identify. And I once heard Princess Nokia say, like, I identify the biological way, and then they basically synonymously said the biological way, the soulful way. It's just like an interesting thing, like especially if you don't necessarily know your heritage yet. To find that out and then feel like, okay, I deeply identify with this or whatever. But
only a Roby can find a way to like time Princess Nokia into it. Yes, Robert. Well done.
There you go.
Love it.
Well, let's do a quick round here. Clint, is that a signal? or noise?
Oh, it's totally a signal. I think it's like it's like Kofi nailed it on the perfect definition of a weak signal.
Yeah.
Because it's something you can easily overlook. It wouldn't even be a headline in a newspaper, but it's like, no, that was the moment that caused all these other things to happen. I think it's like perfect.
Yeah. Aldous?
Yeah, I like that take. I think it does. Yeah, I think it opens up all these questions of like, yeah, what's the next model of development? You know, like we're facing a climate crisis and carbon-led industrialization is not going to work for many countries anymore. So what does that look like? You know, and maybe these are signals of what those networks and stuff look like, although very still ambiguous or something like that to me, right?
It also ties in lots of back to the electrifying piece of Toronto. If we like go all the way full circle, the beginning of the conversation, right? We remember that moment on Ossington and Queen being that very weak signal that now is just, if you speak Toronto, I tell this to people all the time, from a culinary level, from sonic level, just like thought, tech. And so like glad to have been a part of that. It is kind of wild when you think about it. The Shopifys, the Well Simples, the lanes.
I forget how dope it is here till someone's visiting that hasn't been. And I'm like, oh, I try to fill up like an itinerary and it's like, there's no end. It's like, let me show you all of the best food. It's a good place. Yeah. We sleep on it sometimes being from here, but it's like, yeah, where else do you want to be?
That's part of the Toronto style, though.
It's always been part of the style to sleep on it. Anyway, that's a signal. Kofi, congratulations. You're the first winner of this game show. We never had one before, but that was the most hard to sort of detect, as Clint was pointing out, the hard to detect weak signal that potentially has a hugely powerful impact. You nailed the sort of impossibility of like these opposing targets that we're going for when bringing these in. So well done.
Thank you.
I was also told there would be no winners or trophies awarded.
Yeah. So you didn't bring your A game? Is that why?
Should have known that was clearly a lie, but that's cool.
I mean, I believed it until Kofi came in and changed the game.
No, we tried.
That's a weak signal. The whole thing's changed. The game's changed now.
All right. What did you think, Jeremy? How did you think about the whole thing?
That was great. I mean, it's often interesting how these things tie in some way.
My new religion, 3 signals a week is how I find meaning. It's my horoscope.
Sign me up, Rob.
Yeah, just pick 3 random things. It's as good as anything else. Use it to find meaning in your life. Right.
That's true. How have we changed your trajectory, though, with today's conversation?
I've been trying to make a trip to Ghana. I've been like, that's been on my mind for a long time. So I think that's like, I got more convinced, I'm less cynical about digital nomads. That's just like an idea in my head that like, it's annoying for people to identify as digital nomads.
You're supposed to be more cynical.
You wanted that? Yeah, it could have made for a lively discussion. But I don't know. And then I just liked learning about the Valdez signal. I think that's like already was like, that's the type of shit I'm excited about with technology. So I'll let you know what comes, Clint, as far as what kind of meaning I make of it and what new mythology arises for me this week.
I appreciate that. There's some triangulation between ancient scrolls, digital nomads, and a flight to Accra.
Is it somewhere there? We'll find it.
Yeah, this show is the most Rob Bolton thing I could think of. It really, it really is. I love it.
But it might all be within the ancient scrolls.
Correct.
Who knew? That's
correct.
all accumulated to is that might be it.
That would be insane. That would be insane.
The prophecies. Yeah.
Is it new Top Photo ad? The handbag guys and so forth.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, just check it out. It's actually quite wild. And he just, how Fat Joe says today's price is not yesterday's price. Yeah. So they have Fat Joe in the ad as like saying that, and people set the price bet based on their bidding, but in real time for any. Oh product.
Yeah, I did hear. Yes. I thought that was such a good like dynamic, and he's calling it like dynamic pricing, which like in most occasions is probably used in really exploitative ways to just get the most out of you possible. But they're kind of like
he's doing the opposite.
It's like you can
like, let's go bottom down. We can get this at $80.
Yeah, it's rad. You need to sometimes do things that are like just for the people, just
for
the customer. In that case.
I enjoy Telfa. I think they've got the best marketing PR because it's just so American and honest. It's very Black American and honest.
I agree.
As the only person who have a trans woman with a bag on and a young guy with an AR-17 and a baby crawling all in one image. You're like, yes, this is America. I get it. You've summed it all up.
Yeah, it's true. Man, America's great. I don't know. I've spent a bunch of time in LA and I think it's like being around people who believe their life will get better when they get that truck or whatever. Like it's fucking good to be around sometimes. It's like whether it's true or not is irrelevant. it's fucking good to be around that kind of motivation a lot, you know? We don't have it in Canada. That's the thing. I'll let you guys go. Thanks so much again.
All right, brothers.
We'll talk
Thanks,
soon.
guys. Thanks, everybody.
Take it easy. Rob, can I get a sign off from you before you log off?
Broadcast from later.
Perfect. Thanks.